We often obsess over boomers, we analyze millennials, and we are fascinated by Gen Z. But there is one generation we rarely talk about in depth, Generation X, born roughly between 1965 and 1980. To the modern eye, they often look like the stoic ones, the employees who work hard, rarely complain, and seem to accept whatever pressure is thrown their way. Any industry, any deadline. If there is work, they just do it. But this isn't a coincidence. It is the direct result of how they were raised.
Many Gen Xers grew up as Latchkey Kids, a term for children who routinely came home to an empty house because both parents were working. They unlocked the door themselves, made their own snacks, did their homework alone, and then waited. By 1984, around 7 million children between the ages of 5 and 13 were living this reality. That isn't just a number. That is an entire generation learning one fundamental lesson very early on. If you want something done, you have to do it yourself.
This upbringing created what psychologists call a high contingency environment, an environment where every single action has an immediate consequence. If you messed up, the fallout was instant. There was no long negotiation, no time out to discuss your feelings. Children growing up in this world learn to think fast, calculate risks, and always plan their next move. But there was a side effect. Because emotion wasn't given space, they learned to suppress it. They learned to function even when they were tired, confused, or scared. In other words, they learned to survive.
As Gen X entered adulthood, they watched divorce rates skyrocket, saw corporations lay off loyal workers, and watched the promise of stability crumble. They realized that hard work didn't always guarantee safety. Psychologists call this mental pattern defensive pessimism. It isn't about being negative, it's about being prepared. For Gen X, this isn't pessimism, it's vigilance. They hope for the best, but they are always ready for the rug to be pulled out from under them.
Because of this, Gen X grew up to be the ultimate grinders. They rarely cherry-pick tasks, and they rarely complain. If there is a responsibility, they handle it. To them, work is something you finish, not something you announce. This is why so many Gen Xers seem quiet in the digital world. It's not because they don't understand technology. In fact, they were the first generation to use office computers, email, and the early internet. The difference is their relationship with it. Gen X used technology as a tool, not an identity. They didn't grow up using screens to express themselves. They grew up with the real world as the center of their lives.
Gen X rarely broadcast their problems. If there is a burden, they don't look for a place to vent, they look for a solution. If there is a responsibility, they don't ask who can help me, they ask what can I do? Because since childhood, they learned one simple truth. Life doesn't stop just because you're tired.
When Gen X is stressed, they rarely take it to the internet. You won't see long status updates or tearful explainer videos. Instead, they go offline. They meet friends, hang out with family, and talk face to face. Because since childhood, they were used to processing emotions through real connections. When the pressure hits, they look for humans, not algorithms.
There is a massive paradox here. Gen X is incredibly independent, but that is exactly why they struggle to ask for help. Not because they don't have anyone, but because asking for help feels like admitting defeat. However, if you need them, they usually show up without drama and without an announcement. Because for them, care is shown through action, not words.
Gen X grew up in the era before Google. If they wanted to know something, they had to hunt for it, go to the library, read a book, wait for an answer. Cognitive psychologists call this deep encoding. Information gained through effort sticks harder in long-term memory. That's why they are used to deep learning, fixing things with their hands and solving problems without a tutorial. Not out of nostalgia, but because back then there was simply no other choice.
Gen X lives between two worlds, the analog and the digital. They are the bridge generation. But this role comes with a price. When you are raised to be independent, you get used to not relying on anyone. When you are used to fixing things yourself, you get used to not asking to be understood. Over time, you become an expert at surviving, but you lose the ability to express what's inside. And maybe that is the real reason why Gen X seems so quiet. Not because they don't have a story, not because they don't care, but because they were taught that responsibility is something you carry alone. Raised to work, not to complain, to survive, not to tell tales. And maybe they aren't silent. They have just been strong, on their own, for too long.